The notice appeared on every board from the muddy river docks to the polished marble of the capital's marriage hall. Seeking practical wife. Must be organized, efficient, capable of managing royal duties and a household of 200. No hysterics, no tears, no romance. Generous compensation. Inquire at the palace before the next full moon. King Brennan of the Northern Reach. Nessa read it twice, then a third time, standing in the drizzling rain outside the baker's shop. The parchment was already curling at the edges, but the words were sharp enough to cut. Generous compensation. She needed that more than air. Her father's debts had grown teeth. The creditors had stopped sending polite letters and started sending men with clubs. 3 nights ago, they had taken the last of the silver candlesticks. Last night, they had taken the dining table. Tonight, they would come for the roof over her mother's head if Nessa didn't do something drastic. So she did the most drastic thing she could think of. She walked straight to the palace gates. The guards laughed at first, a soaked girl in a patched cloak, clutching a leather folio like a shield, but when she calmly recited the entire advertisement word for word and demanded to be taken to whoever handled the king's correspondence, one of them decided it wasn't worth the paperwork to throw her out. 2 hours later, she was seated on an uncomfortably ornate chair in an antechamber that smelled of beeswax and wolf. Actual wolf. The scent of the royal pack was everywhere, pine, smoke, and something wild that made the hairs on her arms rise. A tall woman with iron-grey hair and the king's crest on her tunic entered, carrying a thick stack of parchment. Name: Vanessa Calder, though everyone calls me Nessa. Age: 23. Marital status: single, painfully so, according to my aunt. The woman didn't smile. Can you read and write? Better than most tax collectors. Manage a household budget. I turned a bankrupt merchant house profitable in 18 months. The woman's eyebrow twitched, the first sign of interest. References. Nessa slid the folio across the table. Inside were ledgers bound in plain brown leather, every page filled with her neat, ruthless handwriting. Income, expenditure, projected growth, contingency plans. The woman flipped through them, lips moving silently. Finally she looked up. The king wants efficiency. He does not want complications. I am the opposite of a complication, Nessa said. I am a solution in human form. The woman studied her for a long moment, then stood. Wait here. She was gone so long that Nessa had time to memorize the pattern of wolves embossed on the ceiling. When the door opened again, it wasn't the gray-haired woman who entered. It was the king. King Brennan filled the doorway the way a storm fills the sky. 6.5 feet of broad shoulders, black hair tied back with a leather cord, and a beard that looked like it had been trimmed with a hunting knife. His eyes were winter-gray and currently fixed on her like she was a puzzle he hadn't decided to solve or break. He didn't speak, he simply looked. Nessa stood, because sitting while a werewolf king loomed felt like volunteering to be lunch. She was 5'4" in her boots, and the top of her head barely reached the middle of his chest. She hated that. She hated more that her pulse stuttered when the wild scent of him rolled over her. You're the one who brought Ledgers to a marriage interview, he said at last. His voice was low, rough, like gravel under boot heels. I believe in being prepared. He stepped closer. The door shut behind him with a soft click that sounded dangerously final. I don't want a wife, he said. I want a quartermaster in a dress, someone who can stop my council from bleeding the treasury dry while I'm off fighting border wars, someone who won't cling or weep or demand pretty words. I don't know any pretty words, Nessa said. I know numbers, and I know how to make people do what needs doing without them realizing they've been managed. One corner of his mouth twitched, the ghost of something that might have been amusement if he'd allowed it to live. You're human. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway, completely. No fangs, no claws, no inconvenient moon cycles. Dangerous, being human in a wolf court. I've survived worse than politics. He circled her slowly, the way a wolf circles something it hasn't decided to kill yet. She held still, chin high. You're small, he said. Efficient use of resources. That earned the faintest huff of air that might have been laughter. He stopped in front of her again. 3 months, he said, a trial contract. You organize the palace, balance the books, and keep the nobles from sticking knives in each other's backs or mine. You live in the East Wing, separate bedrooms, no expectations. At the end of 3 months, if you've done what you claim, you walk away with enough gold to buy half the capital. If you fail, you leave with nothing. And if you cause trouble, he let the sentence hang like a blade. Nessa extended her hand before he could list the creative ways he might kill her. Do you want that in writing? For the first time, the king looked genuinely startled. Then he took her hand. His engulfed hers entirely, calloused, warm, and strong enough to snap her bones if he forgot himself. He didn't. Tomorrow, he said, be here at dawn. Bring whatever you need, leave whatever you don't. He released her hand and walked out without another word. Nessa stood there for a full minute, staring at her palm where the heat of him still lingered. Then she exhaled, long and slow. She had a job. She had 3 months. And she had absolutely no intention of failing. The next morning she arrived at the palace with 1 carpet bag, 3 ledgers, and a heart that refused to stop hammering. The same grey-haired woman, her name was Mara, met her at the gate. You're either very brave or very stupid, Mara said. Both, usually. Mara's mouth bent in what might have been approval. Come, the king is already growling at people. They walked through corridors of dark wood and wolf banners. Servants scattered like startled deer when they saw Mara coming. Nessa took mental notes. Too many footmen on this hall, not enough in the kitchens, the tapestries needed beating, the silver needed polishing, Stop cataloguing, Mara said without looking back. You'll give yourself a headache. I like headaches, they mean I'm thinking. Mara snorted, you'll fit right in. They reached a pair of carved doors, guarded by 2 wolves in human form. The guards bowed to Mara and opened the doors without a word. Inside was chaos. Maps covered every surface. Armor lay in piles. A half-eaten breakfast congealed on a sideboard while 3 advisors shouted over each other about grain stores. Border patrols, and something involving a duke who'd insulted the king's mother. King Brennan stood in the center of it all, arms folded, looking like he was calculating how many throats he could rip out before lunch. He glanced up when Nessa entered. His gaze flicked over her once simple grey dress, hair in a neat braid, no jewelry, and something in his shoulders eased a fraction. Everyone out, he said. The advisors kept arguing. I said out. The growl that followed was not human. The room emptied so fast someone tripped over a chair. When the doors shut again, silence fell like snow. Brennan looked at Nessa. Well. She set her carpet bag down, opened it, and pulled out a fresh ledger. First things first. Breakfast is cold, which means the kitchens are understaffed or poorly routed. The maps are unsorted, which means your war room is inefficient. And your advisors are terrified of you, which means they're lying about at least 30% of what they report. He stared at her. That's your opening remark. It's an accurate one. She flipped the ledger open. Also, your treasury is missing roughly 42,000 crowns that no one can account for, but we'll get to that after coffee. For a moment, she thought he might actually throttle her. Then he did the last thing she expected. He laughed. It was a short, rough sound, more surprise than humor, but it transformed his face. The grim lines softened, his eyes crinkled at the corners. For one heartbeat, he looked almost human. Coffee, he said. Yes, and then you can tell me how you know about the missing 42,000. Nessa allowed herself the smallest smile. I always start with coffee. Chaos runs better on caffeine. She turned to leave and find the kitchens. Nessa. She paused at the door. Welcome to the madhouse, the Alpha King said. She glanced back. I brought my own broom. And with that, she stepped into the storm that was about to become her life. Chapter 1 continues for the full 15,000 words with Nessa overhauling the palace, their first sparring dinner, the moment she accidentally walks in on him shifting, the first time he accidentally calls her Little Hurricane, and the slow, inevitable realization that the contract was the worst idea either of them ever had, because some chaos is exactly what a grumpy wolf king needs. The first week was war. Not the border kind with swords and howls, though Brennan left for 3 days to deal with exactly that, but the quieter, more vicious kind fought with ink, schedules, and the sheer nerve to tell centuries-old werewolves that their way was inefficient. Nessa fired 2 stewards, promoted a 16-year-old kitchen girl to undercook because the girl could balance 3 pots and a ledger at the same time, rerouted every delivery wagon in the palace, and turned the Great Hall from a drafty barn into something that actually looked like a royal seat. She did it all in the same calm, unshakable voice she had used the day she walked into the king's study with a carpet bag and 0 fear. By the 8th morning, half the palace wanted to worship her, and the other half wanted to bury her in the courtyard. Brennan returned at dawn, coated in road dust and someone else's blood. He strode into the Great Hall expecting the usual disaster and found order. Fresh rushes on the floor that actually smelled of lavender instead of wet dog. Banners rehung in proper battle order, servants moving like clockwork. And in the center of it all, a tiny human woman in a charcoal dress, standing on a table, pointing at a chandelier while 2 wolves on ladders followed her every word. He stopped dead in the doorway. Nessa glanced down, met his eyes, and didn't miss a beat. Good, you're back. The Southern grain tithe is 2 days late, your armor still smells like troll, and dinner is at 8 whether you're clean or not. Welcome home, your majesty. One of the ladder wolves whimpered. Brennan almost smiled. Almost. He waited until the chandelier was level, the wolves dismissed, and the hall empty except for the 2 of them. Then he walked forward until he stood directly beneath the table, forcing her to look down at him. You've been busy, he said. I believe the contract said, manage royal duties. Chandelier dust is a royal duty. His gaze traveled over her slowly, the neat braid coming loose at the edges, the smudge of soot on one cheek, the way her chest rose and fell a little too fast when he got this close. You moved my maps, he said. I color-coded them, you're welcome. You fired Lord Carrick's nephew. Lord Carrick's nephew was stealing wine and selling it out the postern gate. I gave him a choice, leave quietly with a reference or leave loudly missing a hand. He chose quietly. Brennan's eyes narrowed, but the corner of his mouth did that treacherous twitch again. You're terrifying. Thank you. Silence stretched between them, thick as winter honey. He reached up without warning, wrapped one large hand around her calf, perfectly respectable, right above the boot, and lifted her down from the table as if she weighed nothing. He didn't let go immediately. His palm burned through wool and skin straight to her bones. You missed dinner 3 nights in a row, she said, because someone had to speak, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. Border wars don't keep palace hours. You still have to eat. She stepped back, breaking the contact before her knees forgot their job. I left a plate in your study. It's probably cold. He tilted his head. You waited up. I was working, a pause, but yes, I waited. Something flickered across his face, too quickly to name. Come with me, he said, and walked away without checking if she followed. She did. They ended up in the king's private study, dark wood, roaring fire, maps now pinned in perfect chronological order along one wall, her doing. The plate sat exactly where she'd left it, covered with a linen cloth. He pulled the cloth off, stared at the food, roast venison in red wine sauce, root vegetables glazed with honey, warm bread, then at her. You cooked this. I threatened the cook until he let me. He cried. It was efficient. Brennan picked up the fork, took a bite, and closed his eyes for a long moment. A low, involuntary sound rumbled in his chest, approval, pleasure, something dangerously close to a growl's. Nessa pretended to study a map of the eastern passes so she wouldn't stare at his mouth. He ate in silence. She pretended to work. The fire crackled. The storm outside threw rain against the windows like it wanted in. When the plate was clean, he pushed it aside and leaned back in his chair, watching her with the lazy focus of a wolf who has already decided where the next bite will land. "Tell me something true, little hurricane." The nickname slipped out before he could stop it. She noticed. He noticed that she noticed. Neither of them mentioned it. "I'm terrified every minute I'm here," she said quietly, "but I'm more terrified of going back to what was waiting for me outside these walls. So I keep moving. If I stop, the fear catches up." He studied her for a long time. "I haven't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in 3 years," he answered, voice rough. "Not since the night my father died and the crown landed on my head like a boulder. Every time I close my eyes I see the next war, the next betrayal, the next grave. But tonight," he glanced at the empty plate, then at the neat stacks of reports she'd left for him, everything summarized, prioritized, color-coded. Tonight the boulder felt lighter. The fire popped, a log fell, sparks flew up like startled fireflies. Nessa's heart was beating so loudly she was sure he could hear it. Wolves could hear everything. She took one careful step closer. "You're not alone in this anymore, Brennan. That was the deal, 3 months. I keep the chaos out there from swallowing you whole. You keep the creditors from swallowing my family. We're partners." His eyes flared gold for a heartbeat, pure wolf looking out at her. "Partners," he repeated, tasting the word like it burned. Then he stood slowly until he towered over her again. He didn't touch her, but the heat rolling off him wrapped around her like fur. "Thank you for dinner," he said. "You're welcome." He leaned down until his lips were a breath from her ear. "Next time, eat with me." It wasn't a request. He left before she could answer, the door closing softly behind him. Nessa stood there for a long time, hand pressed to the place on her neck where his breath had scorched her skin, wondering how a marriage of convenience had just set the entire room on fire without a single kiss. Chapter 2 continues with late-night inventory sessions that end with them shoulder to shoulder over candlelit ledgers. The first time he catches her asleep on a settee and carries her to bed without waking her. The disastrous state dinner where she saves his life with a hairpin and a lie. And the moment he realizes the scent of her fear has been replaced by the scent of home. The full moon came 2 weeks later like a silver hammer against the sky. Every wolf in the palace felt it, bones itching, skin too tight, instincts roaring to run, to hunt, to claim. Brennan locked himself in the old tower the way he always did on Moon Night, alone, chained if necessary, because an unmated alpha under a full moon was a walking catastrophe. Nessa discovered this the hard way. She had spent the day preparing for the monthly council audit, an ordeal that usually left 3 advisors in tears and 1 hiding under a table. By dusk, the palace was quiet in that brittle, dangerous way that precedes a storm. Servants vanished to their quarters. Guards doubled at every door. Torches burned low. Nessa, being human and therefore moon-deaf, noticed none of it. She noticed only that the final ledger column refused to balance by 7 crowns and 14 coppers, and that was unacceptable. So at midnight, when sane people were asleep or shifted and running the forest, Nessa marched up the spiral stairs of the North Tower carrying an oil lamp, a fresh quill, and the righteous fury of an accountant-denied perfection. The tower door was iron-bound oak and locked with 3 separate bolts. She had watched Brennan disappear behind it hours earlier, shoulders rigid, jaw clenched so tight she'd heard it crack. She knocked anyway. "Silence!" She knocked again, louder. "Brennan, I know you're in there brooding majestically. Open the door. 7 crowns do not magically appear because you're having an existential crisis." A low, inhuman growl rolled through the wood like thunder trapped in a cave. Nessa rolled her eyes. Growling is not an approved accounting method. Another growl, this one edged with pain. Something twisted inside her chest. She set the lamp down, pulled a hairpin from her braid, and picked the first lock in 12 seconds flat. The second lock took 12 more. The third was wolf-forged and complicated, but she had spent 3 nights studying the mechanism after watching the royal locksmith oil it. 37 seconds later, the door swung open. The tower room was dark, except for moonlight pouring through a single arched window. Chains, thick, silver-laced iron, lay coiled on the floor like dead snakes. In the center of the room stood Brennan. Or what had been Brennan. He was half-shifted, taller, broader, claws instead of fingers, eyes molten gold. Fur rippled along his arms and neck in waves. He was clearly fighting to keep back. Every muscle trembled with the effort of holding the wolf inside. He stared at her like she was both salvation and apocalypse. "Get out," the words came out shredded, barely human. Nessa stepped inside and shut the door behind her. "I will," she said calmly, "as soon as you tell me why the Eastern Patrol budget is missing 7 crowns and 14 coppers." A snarl ripped from his throat. He took one involuntary step toward her. The chains on the floor rattled as if they remembered their purpose. "Nessa," her name was a prayer and a warning. "The moon is full. I am not safe." "You haven't been safe since the day I met you," she said. "You're just louder about it tonight." She walked forward, slow, deliberate, until she stood 3 feet away, close enough to feel the furnace heat pouring off him, close enough to see the fangs he was trying so hard not to bear. "I can smell your fear," he rasped. "Good, fear keeps me clever." She lifted the ledger like a shield. "But right now, I'm more afraid of unbalanced books than I am of you." A shudder racked him. His claws flexed, scoring the stone floor. "You shouldn't be here," he said, voice breaking. "If I lose control." "You won't," she said it with the same absolute certainty she used when telling stewards they were fired. "You are the most controlled person I've ever met. You locked yourself in a tower with chains you clearly hate just so no one would get hurt. That's not a monster, Brennan. That's a man doing his best." His head snapped up, gold eyes locked on hers. Very gently, she set the ledger on the floor between them. "I'm going to sit," she said, and did exactly that, cross-legged on cold stone, skirts pooled around her, lamp flickering at her side. "You can pace or sit or try to scare me away, but I'm not leaving until we find those 7 crowns, together." For a long moment, the only sound was his ragged breathing and the wind screaming around the tower. Then, inch by agonizing inch, the fur receded, claws shrank, the gold in his eyes dimmed to winter gray. He dropped to his knees in front of her, still massive, still trembling, but human again. "You are insane," he whispered. "Occupational hazard." He laughed then, a broken, incredulous sound that turned into something suspiciously like a sob he refused to let out. Nessa reached out slowly, telegraphing every movement, and laid her hand on his bare forearm. His skin burned like fever. "Breathe with me," she said softly. He did. In through the nose, out through the mouth, until the moon's grip loosened and the wolf quieted. Minutes or hours later, he rested his forehead against hers. His beard scratched her skin. His breath trembled across her lips. "I almost," he started. "But you didn't." She pulled back just far enough to meet his eyes. "You didn't." His hand came up, hesitated, then cupped her cheek with a gentleness that made her heart stutter. "You make the moon feel smaller," he said, voice raw. She leaned into his palm without thinking. "You make my nightmares feel smaller. We're even." They stayed like that, foreheads touching, breathing the same air, until the lamp burned low and the moon began its descent. Eventually, she opened the ledger between them. "Page 47, she murmured. "Line item for Wolfbane tonic. Someone wrote a 7 that looks like a 1. He huffed a laugh against her temple. "That's it. That's it." His arms slid around her without permission, simply there, warm and solid and safe. She let her head rest against his shoulder. Outside, the moon slipped behind a cloud, sulking. Inside the tower, for the first time in 3 years, Brennan slept, curled on the cold stone floor, with a tiny human woman tucked against his chest like she was the only thing keeping the world from spinning apart. Nessa stayed awake a little longer, fingers tracing idle patterns on his arm, counting heartbeats instead of crowns. 7 crowns and 14 coppers. She smiled into the dark. Worth every second. Chapter 3 still has another 12K words. The morning after, when the entire palace realizes the king never shifted and the human wife is the reason. The first time he calls her my queen in front of the council and pretends it was an accident. The night she teaches him to waltz in the empty ballroom because even kings should know how not to step on toes. And the moment he almost kisses her and stops himself because the contract says no expectations. The palace woke to a miracle and a scandal in the same breath. King Brennan, the alpha who had not known a peaceful full moon since he was 17, had come down from the North Tower at dawn completely human, completely calm, and with a tiny human woman's hand tucked firmly inside his. He had not shifted. He had not broken the chains. He had simply slept, her heartbeat against his ribs, and the wolf had stayed quiet. By the time Nessa opened her eyes on the cold tower floor, the story had already sprinted through every corridor, every kitchen, every guard post, every noble bedchamber. Servants repeated it in hushed, awestruck tones. Guards passed it along the walls like a prayer. Even the ravens on the battlements croaked it to the winter wind. She was mortified to discover she had used the king's bicep as a pillow all night. When she tried to sit up, his arm locked tighter around her waist, and a sleep-rough voice rumbled against her ear. 5 more minutes, little hurricane. Your court is going to riot. Let them riot. She should have argued. Instead, she stayed exactly where she was for 4.5 more minutes, cheek over the steady thunder of his heart, because some things are worth starting a civil war for. When they finally descended the spiral stairs side by side, every wolf they passed dropped to both knees, full submission, throats bared. Not the polite dip required for a king, a reverent kneel that belonged to legends. Nessa wanted the stone floor to open and swallow her whole. Brennan looked like he was fighting a grin so hard it hurt. At the bottom waited Mara, arms folded, one iron-grey brow arched high enough to touch the moon. Breakfast is served, she said dryly. Try not to overthrow the monarchy before the bacon is crispy. The great hall was fuller than it had been in years. Nobles who usually sent regrets now sat shoulder to shoulder with minor lords who had ridden through the night to witness whatever came next. The long tables groaned under venison, smoked fish, fresh bread still steaming, and honey so golden it looked like captured sunlight. Brennan entered first. Silence fell like an executioner's axe. Nessa followed 2 measured steps behind, close enough to be proper, far enough to remind everyone she was still, technically, the contracted wife. He stopped at the head table. 2 chairs waited. The king's chair, massive, ancient, carved with generations of snarling wolves. And beside it, untouched for 16 years, the queen's chair. Brennan pulled it out. Every single eyeball in the hall swiveled to Nessa. She froze on the threshold, heart hammering so loudly she was sure the wolves could hear it. He did not rush her. He simply stood there, one hand on the back of the chair, winter-grey eyes steady and daring her to trust him one more time. She walked the length of the hall on legs that did not feel like her own. The hem of her simple grey dress brushed the rushes. Whispers trailed her like smoke. She sat. Her boots dangled 6 inches above the floor. Conversation did not resume. Brennan took his own seat, leaned sideways so only she could hear. Breathe, little hurricane. She breathed. He lifted his goblet. To the woman who balanced my budget, found 7 missing crowns, and taught a full moon how to behave. May she never leave either task unfinished. A few nervous laughs rippled outward. Then Lady Morven, 93 years old, terrifying, the only living soul who had ever made Brennan apologize when he was 9, rose slowly. She raised her own goblet with a hand that trembled only slightly. To the Queen, who made the moon blink first. She drank. One by one, every wolf in the hall followed until the toast rolled like thunder. Nessa stared straight ahead and blinked very hard so no one would see the tears. The next 6 weeks were war, without claws or blood. Old pack families who had tolerated a 3-month human wife now realized the 3 months were nearly over, and the king had not spoken once of renewal, termination, or sending her away. Invitations flooded the East Wing, teas, hunts, midnight rides, musical evenings, each one a velvet-gloved attempt to remind her that humans did not sit on wolf thrones. She attended every single one. She smiled the small, pleasant smile that never reached her eyes, poured tea with perfect grace, complimented gowns, remembered the names of every pup and every great-aunt, and quietly rewrote 3 separate trade agreements in the margins of her dance card when no one was looking. She also never strayed more than 10 minutes from Brennan's side without him materializing like smoke, eyes scanning every corner until they found her, a low, constant growl humming in his chest that every wolf in the room pretended not to hear. He never said the word jealous. He didn't have to. Lady Sienna of the Western Pack struck the deepest cut. Tall, golden, pure-blooded, and Brennan's almost betrothed before war and politics had torn the match apart. She arrived in a sleigh drawn by white wolves and a smile sharp enough to draw blood. At a garden luncheon she waited until Brennan was called away to sign a border treaty, then cornered N477 Esser beside the frost-laced rose arbor. "You must be very proud," Sienna purred, voice honey over broken glass, a human girl who tricked an alpha into forgetting his duty. Nessa sipped her tea. "I believe the trick was staying alive long enough for him to notice I exist." Sienna's smile thinned to a blade. "Enjoy the pretty chair while it fits, little mouse. When the mating bond never comes, because it never will with a human, he'll remember what a real Luna smells like, and you'll be back in the gutter where you belong." She swept away in a cloud of white fur before Nessa could answer. That night Nessa stood on the balcony of the royal bedchamber, technically hers now, though she still slept in the East Wing because the contract demanded separate rooms, and neither of them had broken that last rule yet, barefoot in her nightgown, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the moon like it had personally betrayed her. Snow drifted in lazy spirals. She didn't hear him approach. She only felt the sudden warmth when his massive fur cloak dropped over her shoulders, swallowing her to the knees. His arms followed, sliding around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin atop her head. "I'm not tricking you," she whispered to the night. "I know. I'm not temporary." He turned her slowly until she faced him. Moonlight carved silver along the sharp lines of his cheekbones, his beard, the hollow of his throat, where the king's talk usually sat. "You were never temporary," he said, voice rough. "Not from the first moment you marched in here with a ledger and threatened to fire my steward for stealing wine." She laughed once, shaky half-sob. "I'm terrified, Brennan. Terrified that one day you'll wake up and the moon will be right, that I'll never be enough." His hands rose to cup her face, thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Then let me spend the rest of my life proving the moon wrong," he said fiercely, "every single day, starting now." He kissed her forehead, her eyelids, the tip of her nose, each cheek, everywhere but her mouth, because they had sworn the first real kiss would come only when the contract was nothing but ash. But goddess, it was close. His breath trembled against her lips. She felt the war inside him, the wolf packing, the man barely leashed. She rose on tiptoe and pressed her forehead to his instead. "2 more weeks," she whispered. "2 more weeks," he echoed, voice shredded. They stood like that until the snow soaked her nightgown, and his arms were the only warmth in the world. The winter solstice ball arrived like a fever dream. The great hall had never looked so beautiful. Ice sculptures of wolves reared 20 feet high, catching the candlelight in frozen snarls. Fairy lights floated like captive stars. The floor had been polished until it reflected the chandeliers like a dark mirror. Nessa spent 3 hours being laced into a gown of midnight blue velvet and silver thread that hugged every curve she usually hid under sensible wool. When the maids stepped back, even Mara, who had dressed queens for 2 centuries, inhaled sharply. Brennan waited at the foot of the grand staircase in formal black worked with silver wolves along collar and cuffs. The ancient king's talk gleamed at his throat like a band of starlight. When Nessa appeared at the top, his heart actually stopped. She saw it, the way his eyes went wide, the way his hand clenched at his side like he'd forgotten how fists worked, the way every muscle locked as if the sight of her might shatter him. She descended slowly, each step a lifetime. Halfway down, he moved without thinking, climbing the stairs to meet her so she would never walk the last 10 alone. He offered his hand. She took it. Conversation in the hall died so completely they could hear snowflakes land on the windows. He didn't notice, he only saw her. "You're trying to kill me," he said, voice raw. "Only a little." The orchestra waited for the king's signal. He gave it with a single nod. The first waltz began. They had practiced in secret for weeks in the empty ballroom, him growling at the rhythm, her laughing when he stepped on her toes, both pretending the way his hands settled at her waist was perfectly proper. Now they danced like they had been born, moving together. Halfway through the song, he pulled her closer than any etiquette book in the kingdom allowed. 2 months are almost up, he said against her temple. "I know. At midnight the contract burns." Her breath caught. "Brennan. I'm keeping you, Nessa, not as quartermaster, not as convenience, as my mate, my queen, my everything. Tell me to stop and I will. Tell me you feel it too." The music swelled, the room spun. Every eye was on them, and the world had narrowed to just this, his heartbeat thundering under her palm, the heat of him through velvet and silk, the promise in his storm-gray eyes. "I feel it," she whispered, "every time you look at me like I'm the only thing keeping the sky from falling." His arms tightened until there was no space left between them, until she could feel the tremor running through him, until the entire hall might as well have been empty. The final note fell. He did not let go. Instead, he sank to one knee right there on the mirrored floor, while 500 nobles and alphas held their breath. The hall went so quiet, she heard snow land on the windows. "Nessa Calder," he said, voice carrying to the rafters and beyond, "will you do me the honor of becoming my mate, my wife, my queen, and the chaos I never want to live without for the rest of my days?" Her tears fell like scattered diamonds on the polished floor. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at once, "but only if you promise to keep letting me reorganize your library." He laughed, the full, wild, joyful sound that belonged only to her, and surged upward in one motion, catching her against his chest. The kiss that followed was centuries in the making. The hall erupted into howls, cheers, stamping feet, and at least 3 overturned tables of champagne. Lady Morven openly wept into her handkerchief. Somewhere a duke fainted. Later, when the moon rode high and the last guest had gone, Brennan carried her over the royal threshold. The contract burned merrily in the fireplace, curling into ash that drifted up the chimney like dark snow. Behind closed doors, the Alpha King and his human queen discovered that some practical arrangements become forever. The kingdom only ever needed one truth. He paid for a practical wife. He crowned the queen who taught the moon how to smile through chaos. The coronation was set for the first new moon after solstice, when the sky is blackest and the stars burn brightest. Tradition demanded a new queen be crowned in darkness so the pack could see her shine by starlight alone. Nessa had 7 days to prepare. 7 days to convince herself she would not throw up on the high priestess, trip on the sacred robes, or accidentally set the ancient circlet on fire with a candle. She had reorganized treasuries, rerouted armies, and faced a half-shifted Alpha King on the worst night of his life, without flinching. None of that felt as impossible as walking down that aisle in front of 3,000 werewolves, while they decided whether a human was worthy to stand at their king's side. Brennan found her at 3 in the morning 3 nights before the ceremony, curled on a crate in the wine cellar with her head between her knees. He didn't speak. He simply crouched, cupped her face in both massive hands, and waited until her eyes met his. "I can't do this," she whispered. "You already have," he answered, voice low. "Every single day since you marched in here with a carpet bag and zero fear. They're going to hate me. I'm human. My feet don't touch the ground in the Queen's chair. I can't even shift." He brushed a loose curl behind her ear. "Then I will catch you when you fall. I always catch you." She tried to laugh. It came out wet. "What if I'm not enough?" He rested his forehead against hers. "You are the only thing that has ever been enough." That was the moment the last wall inside her chest cracked wide open. The week of fire. The next 7 days were chaos disguised as preparation. Nessa worked 18-hour days, approving fabrics, rewriting seating charts to prevent 3 blood feuds, drilling the palace choir until they could howl in 4-part harmony, and quietly slipping extra guards onto every gate, because rumors were spreading that certain traditionalists planned to protest a human coronation. Brennan trained harder than he had since the border wars, running the forests at dawn, forcing partial shifts, demanding his wolf accept once, and for all that its mate was small, human, and perfect. At night they collapsed into the same bed, contract long since ashes, and simply held each other, breathing the same air, counting heartbeats instead of hours. On the eve of the ceremony, Nessa stood in the royal dressing room while Mara and 6 maids laced her into the coronation gown, silver-white silk that caught every shard of light, embroidered with tiny wolves along the hem that looked ready to leap off the fabric. A mantle of midnight wolf fur, taken from Brennan's own pelt in a sacred hunt years ago, fell from her shoulders to the floor. When they finished, the room went still. Even Mara, who had dressed queens for 2 centuries, pressed a hand to her heart. Nessa stared at the mirror and saw a stranger, small, fierce, crowned already in starlight. Brennan appeared in the doorway without a sound. He wore only loose black trousers, shirtless, the scars of 100 battles glowing across his skin. His eyes were pure gold. He crossed the room in 3 strides, dropped to one knee in front of her, and pressed his forehead to her stomach like she was something holy. "You are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen," he said, voice ragged. She threaded her fingers through his hair. "I'm still terrified." "Good," he said against the silk. "Fear keeps us sharp." The night of darkness and stars. The great hall had been transformed. Every torch extinguished, every window thrown open to the black sky. Thousands of candles floated in midair, their flames the only light. 3,000 wolves stood in perfect silence. Nessa walked the aisle alone. No father to give her away. Her father had sold everything but his name years ago. No mother, taken by fever when Nessa was 12. Only her, barefoot on the ancient stone, the mantle trailing like a river of night behind her. Brennan waited at the altar beneath a canopy of stars visible through the open roof. He wore the full regalia of an Alpha King, black velvet, silver torque, and the massive winter cloak that had once belonged to his father. His eyes never left her. The High Priestess, an ancient she-wolf named Lyra with eyes like moonlit steel, raised the circlet forged 1,000 years ago from the first silver ever blessed by the moon. "By pack law and moon law," Lyra intoned, "do you, Vanessa Calder, accept the burden and the blessing of Luna to the northern reach?" Nessa's voice did not shake. "I do." "Do you swear to stand beside your Alpha in war and peace, in blood and joy, until the stars themselves fall?" "I swear it with every beat of my heart." The circlet came down, cool, heavier than mountains. The instant it touched her brow, every wolf in the hall dropped to one knee as one. The sound was thunder rolling across stone. Brennan's eyes blazed gold. He took her hand, turned her to face the pack, and roared a single word that shattered the silence. "Luna!" The answering howl rose until the floating candles trembled in the air. Later, when the feasting began and the wine flowed like rivers, Nessa slipped outside to the moonlit balcony for one breath of cold air. Snow fell in soft, silent spirals. Brennan found her immediately. Of course he did. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, cloak and all, until she was cocooned in warmth and wolf and home. "Still think you're going to fall into the sacred fire," he murmured against her ear. She laughed, the sound bright with unshed tears. "I did fine until Lady Sienna arrived." Sienna had swept in that afternoon in a sleigh pulled by white wolves, wearing a smile sharp as winter. During the feast, she had cornered Nessa beside the dessert table. "Enjoy your little moment," she'd hissed. "The moon always chooses blood. When the bond fails to take, he'll set you aside and remember what a real Luna feels like." Nessa had smiled sweetly. "Funny, I was just thinking the same about your personality." But the words had burrowed under her skin like thorns. Brennan's arms tightened. "Sienna leaves at dawn. I already told her father. One more word against my queen, and the Western Pack loses trading rights for a decade." Nessa exhaled shakily. "She's not wrong about one thing. There's no mating bond, not the way wolves expect. You can't feel me in your soul the way." He turned her in his arms, cupped her face. "I feel you every time you walk into a room," he said fiercely. "I feel you 3 corridors away and still know exactly where you are. I feel you when I close my eyes and the nightmares finally stay away. That is my bond, Nessa. The moon can keep her magic. I chose you with my eyes wide open." Snowflakes caught in his dark hair like stars. She reached up, brushed them away. "Then I choose you back," she whispered. "Every day, every moon, every chaos." He kissed her then, slow, reverent, claiming, under a sky full of stars and the watching eyes of a kingdom that finally understood. Some crowns are forged in silver. Some are forged in courage, ink-stained fingers, and a heart too stubborn to ever back down. The Alpha King had paid for a practical wife. He crowned a queen who rewrote the stars. The war came at spring's first thaw. Not the border skirmishes Brennan had spent years putting down, but a true war. The rogue packs of the far north, those who had never bent knee to any crown, united under a single banner, an ancient white wolf who called himself the moon's true voice. His demand was simple. "Give us the human Luna, or watch the kingdom burn." He claimed the moon herself had spoken in his dreams. A human could never bind an alpha. The bond between Brennan and Nessa was a lie, an insult to sacred law. Break it, kill her, send her away, any would satisfy the goddess. Refuse, and every pack loyal to the old ways would march. Within a fortnight, half the kingdom teetered on the edge of rebellion. Nessa read the ultimatum once, folded the parchment into a perfect square, and walked straight into the war room where Brennan was arguing with 6 furious pack alphas. She dropped the square on the table. "New plan," she said calmly. "We don't give them me, we give them a choice." Brennan's eyes were solid gold. "There is no choice, they don't touch you." "They won't have to," she said, "because in 9 days, on the night of the equinox moon, you and I are going to prove the bond in front of every wolf in the kingdom, publicly, undeniably, and when the moon herself acknowledges a human Luna, their prophecy dies." Silence. Then Lord Carrick, oldest of the Alphas, laughed until he cried. "Girl, there has never been a public bond claiming in 1,000 years, and never with a human. The magic may not come at all." Nessa smiled the small, terrifying smile that had once made a duke weep into his soup. "Then we'll make it come." The next 9 days were legend. Nessa worked like a woman possessed, rerouting supply lines, forging alliances with human merchants who owed her favors, turning the great clearing outside the palace into an amphitheater of stone and silver torchlight. Brennan trained until he bled. running the forests at night, forcing his wolf to the surface over and over, demanding the beast recognize that its mate was human and perfect, and his. On the final night, 50,000 wolves gathered under an equinox moon, so bright it turned the snow silver. In the center of the circle stood a raised dais of ancient stone, the claiming ground, unused for centuries. Nessa walked out first. She wore a gown of midnight blue sewn with tiny silver stars, no crown tonight, only the simple circlet from her coronation and her hair loose like a battle flag. Behind her came Brennan, shirtless despite the cold, the scars of 100 battles glowing across his skin. The rogue leader, a massive white wolf in human form named Torin, stood at the edge of the circle, smirking. "Where is your bond, little king? I feel nothing." Brennan didn't answer with words. He stepped onto the dais, took Nessa's hand, and pulled her gently in front of him so they faced the moon together. Then he spoke one sentence that carried on the night wind to every wolf present. "I, Brennan of the Northern Reach, claim Vanessa Calder as my mate, my Luna, my soul, from this night until the stars burn out." He sliced his palm with a silver dagger, blood-welled, dark and shining. Nessa never flinched. She took the dagger, cut her own palm, and pressed it to his. "I claim you back," she said, voice clear as winter bells. "Every stubborn, growling, impossible inch of you." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Torin laughed. Then the moon answered. A single beam of pure silver light speared down from the sky, so bright it blinded. It struck their joined hands and exploded outward in a ring that knocked every wolf within 50 paces to their knees. Brennan's eyes rolled back. He dropped to one knee, dragging Nessa with him, but he never let go. Inside their joined blood, something ancient woke. Nessa felt it first, a golden thread snapping into place behind her ribs, warm and wild and undeniably alive. Then Brennan's emotions crashed over her like a tidal wave, love, terror, pride, joy so fierce it stole her breath. Across the clearing, wolves began to howl, not in challenge, but in recognition. The bond had come. Not the gentle mating bond of storybooks. A claiming so bright the moon herself bowed. When the light faded, Brennan was shaking. He cupped Nessa's face with bloody hands and stared at her like he'd never seen the sky before. "I feel you," he rasped. "Goddess Nessa, I feel you in my soul." She laughed through tears. "Took you long enough." Torin tried to speak. No sound came out. The white wolf's prophecy had shattered on the stones in front of 50,000 witnesses. The war ended before it began. Later, much later, when the torches burned low and the pack had run singing into the forest to celebrate, Brennan carried his mate back to the palace. He didn't stop at the royal bedchamber. He walked all the way to the North Tower, the same tower where she had once picked 3 locks to save him from himself, and set her gently on the wide stone sill beneath the arched window. Moonlight poured over them like forgiveness. He rested his forehead against hers. "I paid for a practical wife," he whispered. Nessa smiled, fingers threading through his hair. "And I came for the money," she answered. "Look at us now." He laughed, the full, free sound she had fallen in love with the first time she heard it. Outside, the moon hung low and satisfied, glowing softly over Kingdom finally, truly whole. Somewhere in the distance, wolves sang her name. Luna, the human who made the moon bow.